Good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. On behalf of the Global Labour University Online Academy and the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, I would like to welcome you all in our first online activity for the course Just and Green, Labour Psychological Question in French. Before I hand over to our online tutor to moderate this activity, I would like to encourage you all to enroll in our free online course and to take active part in the online discussions and other workshops lined up for the following weeks. So please stay tuned. Thank you again, and over to you, Noutcha.
Bon après-midi. Bonsoir à tout le monde, bienvenue. Bienvenue dans notre première session de webinaire organisée par la Global University Academy en partenariat avec la Fondation Friedrich Ebert de la TOCT Étudiant Center en Afrique subsaharienne. C'est un réel de vous recevoir aujourd'hui, cet après-midi, pour cette première session d'échange dans le cadre du projet ou alors dans le cadre de la formation juste vers la question écologique du travail. En espérant que vous êtes bien assis ou alors que vous êtes bien installés, on espère que vous avez pu prendre quand même un petit café ou alors une pomme de France pour pouvoir déguster pendant que nous échangeons cet après-midi pour éviter les va-et-vient en fait. Avant que nous entrons dans le vif du sujet de cet après-midi, nous aimerons échanger avec vous des petites modalités pratiques, parmi lesquelles nous allons vous dire que cette réunion est enregistrée. Et si vous ne trouvez pas inconvénience, venez vraiment nous indiquer parce que cet enregistrement est fait dans le but de pouvoir partager avec notre communauté d'appreneurs. Ça peut leur permettre de se connecter en ligne pour pouvoir apprendre davantage. Également, dans le cadre de cette réunion, vous avez la possibilité de suivre cet échange soit en français ou en anglais, dont nous avons un service de traduction. Si vous parlez seulement l'anglais, vous pouvez partir au niveau de votre écran. Si vous utilisez votre téléphone, vous allez trouver 3 barres. Et sur ces 3 barres, vous allez trouver, vous cliquez, vous allez voir ce qui va montrer traduction. Et après cette traduction, vous choisissez la langue que vous êtes confortable. Si vous êtes confortable en français, vous la choisissez. Si vous êtes confortable en anglais, vous la choisissez également. Pour ceux qui utilisent leur machine, je crois que directement, vous allez voir l'icône de traduction. Vous pouvez la choisir directement. Une fois de plus, bienvenue à tous qui nous ont rejoints. Et comme vous savez, cet après-midi, nous allons échanger sur une thématique très importante qui n'est autre que crise environnementale en Afrique, stratégie et alliance. Cette thématique de cet après-midi, nous aurons l'honneur de recevoir une experte dans les questions de changement climatique et transition juste. Cette experte qui nous vient est une alumni de ce programme de la GLU, groupe de 2014 à 2015, qui fut tenu en allemand. Elle défend la durabilité environnementale, la justice sociale, le développement durable, la création de mouvements sociaux et l'autonomisation des jeunes. Elle coordonne également le travail de la CSI en Afrique sur le changement climatique et la transition. En se concentrant plus sur les formations et le développement des capacités, sur les questions de changement climatique, l'élaboration de politiques, le lobbying et le plaidoyer. Elle est également dans la conception et la mise en œuvre des campagnes sur les questions climatiques. Aujourd'hui, elle représente les travailleurs et les syndicats au sein du Forum international, du groupe et des parties prenantes, MGSF, du Programme des Nations Unies pour l'environnement. Et elle dirige également la délégation syndicale africaine au niveau de la Convention cadre des Nations Unies sur les changements climatiques lors des conférences des parties, c'est-à-dire la COP, et d'autres réunions connexes. Juste une petite information sur l'organisation régionale africaine. Nous devons savoir que c'est une confédération syndicale internationale qui représente plus de 7 millions de travailleurs sur le continent et a son siège à Lomé. L'organisation fait partie de la CSI, dont le siège est à Bruxelles. Et elle est représentée à 200 millions de travailleurs dans 163 pays et territoires et compte 332 affiliés nationaux. Notre expert, nous devons savoir, elle est passionnée par les questions de l'économie et du développement. Et en Afrique, elle joue le rôle significatif dans le développement mondial en suivant l'agenda 2063 de l'Union africaine pour le développement durable de l'Afrique. Ceci dit, nous voulons dire bienvenue à notre expert de cet après-midi à la personne de Madame Rhoda Boateng. Rhoda, you're welcome. Vous êtes la bienvenue parmi nous.
Thank you so much, Comrade Noutcha. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here with you all.
C'est un réel plaisir pour nous de vous avoir également parmi nous. Comme vous savez, notre échange aujourd'hui est sur la question relative à la crise environnementale en Afrique, stratégie et alliance syndicale. Pour entrer dans le vif du sujet, nous allons avoir deux formules de cet échange. Nous aurons une première formule qui serait l'échange avec l'expert et la deuxième formule, ça serait d'ouvrir l'opportunité aux participants ici présents de poser des questions en ce qui concerne notre thématique. Pour aller directement, Rhoda, comme vous savez, de nombreux pays africains sont en première ligne de la crise environnementale. Selon un communiqué de presse d'Oxfam publié il y a quelques jours seulement, une personne risque de mourir de faim toutes les 36 secondes à travers le monde. L'année en Afrique de l'Est, frappée par la sécheresse, les régions les plus touchées se rapprochent de la famine. La situation n'est toutefois pas très visible dans les grands médias internationaux. Quelles sont certaines des manifestations extrêmes de cette selon toi?
Right. Thank you so much, Noutcha, for that. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm very delighted to be here, but I'm also very delighted to see this course rolling out, specifically targeting Francophone Africa. Because as we all know, and as you have alluded to, Noutcha, the climate crisis is so intense now. And in Africa, specifically, the manifestations are multiple. East Africa, and perhaps by extension, the Horn of Africa, has been one of the hardest hit regions in the face of the ecological crisis. There are a lot of impacts we're seeing now, specifically on food security, as you mentioned, which is really affecting the region. The locust invasion last year, coupled with COVID, coupled with intense droughts, has led to the fact that now in the region, there's a lot of crisis when it comes to food stability. And so, in fact, East Africa is known to be facing a triple threat in the past few years. But notwithstanding, it's important for us to also make the case that this is not only peculiar to East Africa. And indeed, if you look across the region, across the continent, there are multiple, there's a lot of evidence of climate crisis, of climate impacts across the region. So, for example, if you take Mozambique, for instance, where they had intense floods leading to cyclones, was popularly categorized as Cyclone Idai in the last few years. There were a lot of impacts on people, on infrastructure, on livelihoods, etc. If you take the Southern Africa region and you look at the droughts due to El Nino effects, there are so many impacts. If you look at South Africa, Namibia, and the whole southern parts of the continent. And if you come to the West and you go to countries such as Senegal, such as Sierra Leone, where there are also intense droughts that are actually not following the normal weather patterns as we know it, you also see several effects such as mudslides, loss of property, loss of infrastructure, and sometimes even devastating loss of lives. And indeed, these are not the only impacts as we know it or as we are seeing it in the region. There's also a huge impact, or we're also seeing the impact on health. For instance, where now in most countries with the changing weather patterns, you're seeing a rise in tropical diseases such as malaria, dengue, etc. And so the effects or the manifestations of the climate crisis are multiple and cuts across different spheres, whether it's economic, social, or political. And indeed, speaking about political, it's probably also to make the case about how these contribute to heightened conflicts in certain zones. And so the loss of, displacements are very common now in a lot of countries where there are droughts because people have to survive. And so you're seeing the movements of people who are displaced from communities. There's huge impacts when it comes to land, and the impacts of climate now the ecological crisis is not only limited now to the social impacts, but then indeed an economic impact and indeed a political impact. And it's become so imperative now that we all really join forces to really try to find solutions to the climate crisis. But it's also important to make the case that whilst Africa is one of the hardest hit continents, there's also the notion that Africa has contributed very minimally to climate crisis. And indeed, this is also a concern when it comes to questions around supporting the resilience and adaptation capacities of African countries, because as we know it, African countries are mostly also developing and do not really have the capacity to really support or build their resilience against these kind of crises. And so the climate crisis is really multiple-fold, and the impacts are so grave. For unions, I think what has been the main issue is really the loss of jobs and the loss of livelihoods. And so it's also important for us to really make the case that whilst these crises are being felt in different fields, there is that question of the impact on specific sectors that are being affected. And so if you take the agricultural sector, for instance, if you take manufacturing, if you take the transport sectors, all these sectors are being affected and really are or have to go under a transformation process. And so for the continent, with agriculture being the mainstay for most countries, actually, there is that dilemma now of how to really address the climate crisis because the impacts are so grave, but then in a way that does not also really affect the economies of the countries. And this is where the questions around just transition probably comes in. So I will stop here, and I hope that we can get, if there are any questions, we can come back to responding to some of them later.
Merci beaucoup, Rhoda, pour cette première analyse que tu viens de faire par rapport à cette première question. Vous avez parlé de la question de juste transition, peut-être juste pour en revenir, et peut-être pour dire aussi également à nos participants, si vous avez des questions, veuillez les noter au niveau de la discussion On va prendre vos questions après. Veuillez les noter là-bas. On va les prendre après. Et vous êtes libre également de vous présenter quand vous entrez. Comme ça, on sait où vous nous suivez. Donc, vous pouvez vous présenter votre nom et votre région et vous poser votre question. Ça va nous permettre de connaître qui nous suit et de quel pays. Comme je disais, Rhoda, tu as parlé de la question de transition juste. Tu sais, aujourd'hui, la question de transition juste semble avoir gagné beaucoup de terrain ces derniers temps. Et on aimerait savoir quel signifie ce concept pour les syndicats africains et quelles sont certaines des initiatives prises par les syndicats africains pour faire progresser la transition juste aujourd'hui.
Right. Yeah. So indeed, if we have been following the climate discourse, you would really know that now the catchphrase has become just transition. Sometimes actually even used interchangeably with climate. However, just transition, perhaps it's important for us to note that just transition has been a concept that's been in existence for as far back as the 80s. It was conceived in the trade union movement as far back as in the 80s. However, this concept now has gained a lot of traction since it was introduced into the Paris Agreement in 2015. And this was with a lot of lobby by the trade union movement, but then of course also with other progressive civil society movements. And since then, the concept was also, or at the ILO, which is the International Labour Organization, also published what is popularly known as the guidelines to a just transition. And this has made the concept even more, given some prominence more to this concept. But it's also important for us to know that for different institutions, this concept has varied definitions. Which sometimes or oftentimes is slightly different from the definition that is provided by the international trade union movement. However, for the trade union movement, simply put, when we talk about a just transition, what we mean is, or a just transition is just a tool that is aimed at smoothing the shift towards a more sustainable society and providing hope for the capacity of a green economy to sustain decent jobs and livelihoods. And so it's ensuring that whilst we transform our economies and our societies, the most marginalized in society are not the most affected. And in brief, this is what we mean. So how do we ensure that everyone is adequately catered for whilst we transform our economies? Because we also know that indeed, with the climate crisis comes a need for us to really look at how we transform our economies, how we consume, how we produce. And this is where the just transition concept comes in, that we should ensure that people are not, are not otherwise compromised or marginalized in the process of transforming our society. So how do we ensure that we carry everyone on board? And so for trade unions, this is very important for us. And most often when we look at what a just transition is, we talk about a framework that should respond to creating green jobs. And so ensuring that whilst we transform our economies, whilst we transform our societies, the transformation delivers jobs, and not just jobs, but decent and green jobs. A just transition for us also should be premised on social dialogue. And so how do we ensure that whilst we transform our economies, this is a consultative process. There's a consultative process where we have labor, where we have governments, where we have employer groups present in the design and the implementation of our economy, of the kind of economies we want to see. And so we are also looking at questions around social protection when we talk about a just transition. And this is very important because we know that whilst we transform our economies, there are a lot of jobs that would be lost in some sectors. There are lots of jobs that may be replaced or substituted. And so how do we ensure that whilst this happens, workers actually have or enjoy the benefits that they have to? And so for instance, if a coal mine is shutting down somewhere in South Africa, how do we ensure that perhaps the older workers in this coal mine would enjoy early pension benefits? Or how do we ensure that the younger workers who still have the capacity to work would be reskilled and retrained to work in new and emerging sectors, such as renewable energy? And so these are the things that are important to unions when we talk about a just transition, and that we continue to push so that the transformation of our economies will not compromise or will not further exacerbate existing inequalities that are there. We also look at questions around research, the need for us to continue to invest in research, sound research, early assessments of social and employment impacts of climate policies, etc., to ensure that whatever policies are put in place do not also compromise existing or do not exacerbate existing inequalities. And so this is what a just transition means for us as labor. However, as I made mention, the concept has been really widely embraced and is used sometimes even loosely by everyone or other groups. However, what we are trying to do is to continue to push for a common narrative when it comes to just transition for the continent. And we think this is important so that it's not only a labor-focused approach to just transition, but that we would have a common approach where we bring together other stakeholders, other environmental groups to really shape what the narrative should look like or should be like. Because we think it's important when we have one narrative for us to push, other than different groups, trying to provide different meanings to it. And so this is one of the initiatives that the Regional Organization of Trade Unions is pushing for us to really have what we would call a just transition policy for Africa. That spells out what a just transition should look like for Africa, that defines what a just transition for Africa should be, and really set out a specific framework that can be implemented in different countries to really ensure that a just transition is realized. And there are different initiatives that we are taking to do this. And we're hoping that whilst it is sometimes tedious and difficult, especially because of the different ideologies of different groupings involved, we think that with further work, we would be able to achieve this, which would be to the benefit of all. Because we do not want to reinvent the wheel where we have a situation where the economies we have would not be sustainable, and these economies would still leave a large group of people marginalized. We want transformation as we are pushing to really be sustainable, and a transformation that will carry everyone on board, as we say, so that no one is left behind in the development process.
Merci vraiment beaucoup une fois de plus, Rhoda, pour cette analyse vraiment profonde sur la question de juste transition que beaucoup de personnes aujourd'hui se posent, quoi. Peut-être pour enchérir, vous pouvez également parler des syndicats. On aimerait également savoir, le mouvement syndical, aujourd'hui, on sait qu'elle reconnaît de plus en plus que la justice climatique est une question de justice de classe. Ainsi, les syndicats ont un rôle essentiel à jouer dans le renforcement et le maintien des mobilisations de masse pour faire pression sur les gouvernements en vue de la transformation écologique. Dans quelle mesure cela est-il reconnu par les syndicats en Afrique? Quels sont les principaux obstacles à cette reconnaissance en fait?
Well, if I'm correct, you're talking about initiatives to build alliances and perhaps to build power, if I'm correct. Okay, and so yes, I mean, we really do. I think the climate crisis has made us realize that we cannot work in silos. We cannot continue to do things in different groupings. It's come to a point where we need to really mobilize, build a movement that can really push forward and advance what we really want to achieve. And so the union movement has come a long way, where in the past we were known to have really, just been focused on championing workers' rights. on advancing decent work, on being interested only in questions around wages, minimum wages, living wages. Now, in fact, we are really, we've realized that there's a need for us to really work on issues that all these issues actually touch on or borders on having a sustainable economy, having a sustainable world. And this is why unions have really taken or have really integrated themselves in the climate work. And so for me, there's a lot of progress when it comes to moving outside of the traditional trade union work. And this has actually also opened up the space for us to really engage with other partners that otherwise in the past we weren't really engaging with. And so how are we mobilizing to build power? We've realized it's important for us to identify progressive groups. And here I say progressive because we also really realize that it's important for us to ensure that we work with people who are sort of in the same space or aligned somehow to our ideology. And so identify progressive groups, progressive movements, including women's movements, women's groups, youth, indigenous, farmers, and to really build a mass power. Because indeed, we know that one of the ways to really achieve any set objective is to really build a mass movement, a movement from the ground, a movement that really identifies or really would be able to advance the cause. And to do this, we think it's another approach has been the framing of issues. And it's known somehow that the climate issues generally have somehow been seen as abstract. But the reality is that we have the manifestations of climate impacts are everywhere around us. And indeed, it's become important for us to continue to educate, to let people around us see how this is affecting their daily lives. And so this is one approach that we've been using, framing the issues in a way that identifies with the common person. Because if you speak to anyone, if you speak to, let's say, a farmer in the rural area, they would tell you that, in fact, they are really, things have changed. The weather patterns have changed. They are not being able to harvest their crops in the ways that they were in the past before they could actually determine they had a regular pattern, but now it's not the case. But most of them, they do not understand that these changes are climatic. And indeed, there are ways that they can also, further go around this. And so a lot of education comes to play, a lot of education, a lot of sensitization, trying to get people to really break down the concepts of climate, to make them understand how it's affecting us, and also to make them understand how they in their own capacities can also sort of contribute to the addressing the climate crisis. And so education, building alliances with progressive movements, with different groups, but then also a conscious effort to engage governments, because we all know that whilst trade unions, whilst social movements, whilst different groups can continue to advance their interest in different ways through campaigns, etc., the bulk of the work comes under policy work. And indeed, we need governments when it comes to policies. And so this has also been an approach that we've been using to continue to engage governments, to continue to influence policies at different levels. So at national level, directly with governments, at regional level, with institutions and organizations such as the UNEP, institutions and organizations such as the African Union, at global level, in spaces such as the Conference of Parties, within the UNFCCC processes, continuously trying to push and influence governments, pushing our agenda and our interests to be able to see the changes that we are pushing forward reflected in policies that are passed. But of course, we all know that this is not very easy, and this demands a lot of work. And this is why we believe that building a strong force through networking, through alliance building with different groups, to have a harmonized position, to have a strong movement is the way to go, because we believe in people's power, and we know that change only comes through a concerted effort and a mass movement, which we really are pushing to have across the continent today.
Merci beaucoup une fois de plus, Rhoda, pour des analyses vraiment très profondes par rapport au travail que les mouvements syndicaux font pour promouvoir la question de la transition juste ou alors la transition climatique juste aujourd'hui. Peut-être avant de continuer, on a vu une main levée par Nelson. Je ne sais pas si Nelson veut poser une question. S'il veut poser une question, on peut prendre sa question avant de continuer notre échange. Nelson, tu peux enlever le micro pour prendre la parole directement. Je ne sais pas. Tu es connecté?
Yeah.
Nelson Alsor, on a vu une main. Oui. Vous pouvez vous présenter et puis vous poser la question directement. Ça nous fera plaisir.
Okay, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, Rhoda. I'm happy for the detailed information that you've tried to highlight on climate issues across Africa and the information you are giving us about just transition. But my issue is with the complex nature of African crises. How far has the just transition been able to tackle the so many things that we are facing in Africa? Because you've made mention of maybe mining, but I've not heard of the other sector. How far has that been able to accomplish its target?
Merci, Nelson.
Would you like me to touch on that, Noutcha, to take that right away? Okay, so yeah, I hope that I grasped fully, because there were some breakages. But Nelson, in fact, I must also say it's good to see Nelson, because yes, I know now.
Sur les questions de migration des travailleurs, en fait.
Okay. Right. Thank you also for clarifying, because I missed that aspect. So that's good. And I was saying that it's good to see Nelson, because I know Nelson, but I haven't seen him in a long time. So it's good to see familiar faces. The question around just transition, you're right, touches on so many aspects. And indeed, migration is one of the key areas that has become very prominent today in Africa, because of its sensitivities, because of the fact that we are seeing a huge influx of young people trying to take illegal means to see greener pastures, because of the fact that indeed there is climate impacts also are leading to displacement. And today we are seeing a lot of people who are considered climate refugees. You know, so the question around migration is very critical when it comes to climate, and it's difficult to really link this to just transition. Generally and broadly for Africa, the question of just transition is still a bit disputed amongst different groups for various reasons, such as you raised. For instance, how would just transition tackle or address a sensitive issues such as such as migration, for instance. However, for me, I think that the just transition framework presents an opportunity for us to address all these issues in a way that's in a sustainable way. And so how do we ensure that our policies actually all speak to each other? Our development policies become integrated, because we cannot continue to just address climate issues as climate issues, address migration as migration, address different sectors of the economy in as a standalone. It's become it's more and more, it's become very necessary for us to look at how we can have an integrated approach to really addressing our development challenges. And this is where it's important for us to continue to see how we can integrate such issues, try to draw the links and the nexus between such issues such as climate, migration, climate health, and try to find responses or policy responses that would address these issues, as in a holistic way. because it's the only way to go, other than really looking at addressing these social crises as individual crises, wherein they are really, we see more and more that they are really interlinked. If you take climate and health, there are clear linkages. If you take climate migration, there are clear linkages. All these social issues can be as a result or are indirect results of the climate crisis one way or the other. So it's important for us to continue to draw the linkages between these social issues and ensure that our policies respond to them in an integrated manner, so that we do not have different responses that sometimes do not address the issues holistically. And so I think this is what I would say specifically to you, Nelson, and thanks a lot for your question. I hope that it's adequately covered. Otherwise, hopefully we can also take that up later.
Merci une fois de plus, Rhoda. Mais je pense qu'il y a une petite question qui est un peu liée à la question de Nelson, et celle-ci vient de Tina, qui nous dit que merci, Rhoda, j'apprécie l'information dont tu as partagé. Mais en ce qui concerne la migration des travailleurs, concernant le changement climatique, il y a beaucoup de choses à faire à ce niveau. Qu'est-ce que tu penses de ce phénomène-là, la migration des travailleurs eux-mêmes vis-à-vis à cause du changement climatique?
Yes, I totally agree. There's a lot that has to be done in this area. And it's also very interesting seeing that there's huge interest on the topic, being that the topic wasn't really on climate and migration. But then I hope that somehow maybe this will be covered in the course of your program, or otherwise also this will be taken, this will be noted, being that it's a clear interest to the participants. But indeed, again, as I mentioned, there are clear linkages. There's the huge phenomenon now of climate or internally displaced persons due to climatic issues. And we are seeing this now in many countries, sometimes internally within the countries, but then also more and more now externally, where you are finding people leaving their countries to other countries due to climate displacements. And this actually calls for the need for Africa, for the need for us to continue to build resilience as a continent, because these are just the beginning. It's just what we are about. I mean, we are going to see more and more of this. And so it's important for us to really see how we can reinforce and build the adaptive capacities of our countries, specifically of developing countries. And this is what we continue to push for: financial support financial support for climate victims, to support their relocation sometimes, when it happens, but then also the impacts on livelihoods, because most often we're seeing people lose their livelihoods when they are internally displaced and they have to move. So people who are probably at the coast and know nothing else but fishing have to move to settle somewhere else where they are probably, they cannot fish. Their livelihoods become threatened. And so these are real issues that are very specific to our continent, and we are seeing a rise in these issues and this phenomenon, and it's become more and more important that we find ways to address this, basically by policy responses, but then also more and more strengthening the adaptive capacities, giving people the necessary tools to probably also adapt and begin and find alternative livelihoods when these come up. Also trying to generally engage at global level for us to continue to support the adaptive capacities of developing countries, because this is really what is needed. How do we build resilience for these people or for these countries that are very vulnerable in the face of climate, and where we know that the people actually do not have the capacity to really, fend for themselves and to actually build their resilience. And so these are critical issues, specifically when it comes to labor. Trade unions are continuously seeking ways to work with people at national level, people in rural areas, to really also educate them, help them to build that capacity. And when it comes to, you know, when they are found in such a situation.
Merci une fois de plus, Rhoda, pour cette analyse vraiment brillante. J'espère que Tino a été un peu satisfait par rapport à ceci. Juste rappeler nos audiences qui nous suivent un peu partout dans le monde. Nous sommes en train de faire un webinaire. La thématique, crise environnementale en Afrique, stratégies et alliances syndicales. Et pour cet échange de cet après-midi, nous avons une expert, Rhoda Boateng, qui nous entretient sur cette question de crise environnementale en Afrique. À présent, nous allons ouvrir une autre série de questions et nous avons là Alain Moulumba. Alain Moulumba, je ne sais pas si tu es prêt à poser ta question pour te démuter et puis tu poses ta question directement à notre expert ici présent. Tu te présentes où tu es et puis tu poses ta question. Si Alain n'est pas prêt, je vois une autre main. Là, je vois Rose NST. Rose, si tu es prêt, tu peux poser ta question. En fait.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Okay, merci,
je m'appelle Bébé Rose, je suis syndicaliste, présidente nationale des jeunes du syndicat des employés gradés et cadres des établissements financiers et banques du Cameroun. En tant que jeune syndicaliste, je suis inscrite à cette formation pour pouvoir renforcer mes capacités sur la thématique qui n'est pas très bien développée au niveau de mon pays, ou alors peut-être que je n'ai pas beaucoup de connaissances des actions prioritaires que mènent les syndicats de mon pays pour cette thématique. Et c'est pour ça que je m'y intéresse.
Oh, apparemment, nous avons perdu la connexion avec Rose NST. Rose, peut-être tu peux revenir quand la connexion est stable. Je ne sais pas si Alain, en ce moment, est disposé à poser sa question.
Allô? C'est bon, la question, vous avez suivi?
Ok, je vois que NST est revenu. Nous pouvons suivre.
Oui, je disais, je voulais savoir si dans le module de cours, nous aurons un module qui va intégrer l'impact de la transition juste et les emplois décents.
Oui, bonjour. Moi, je n'arrive pas à écouter ce que l'autre
merci NST
dit,
pour ta brillante question.
rien
Tu
qui
voulais
sort comme
savoir
ça.
si pendant nos échanges, il y aura un module qui va intégrer la question de migration, de l'impact en fait de la juste transition. Si c'est la question, je pense qu'il y a d'autres modules. On a 6 modules en fait et on aura l'occasion d'échanger sur cela bien après ce webinaire. Donc, il faut patienter à la fin de notre webinaire et puis on va pouvoir échanger avec tous les participants qui sont enregistrés en ce moment.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Je ne sais pas s'il y a une autre question. Est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un qui veut poser la question en ce qui concerne la thématique que nous avons changée? La thématique que nous avons changée. Peut-être en attendant que nous ayons peut-être une autre personne.
There were a lot of questions in the chat. Maybe you could, yeah.
OK, on va essayer de parcourir un peu le chat. OK, il y a, je crois qu'il y a Nathaniel qui pose la question, je sais pas. Je sais pas si Nathaniel peut prendre la parole, il pose sa question directement. Parce que je vois sur la question de Nathaniel, il dit comment est-ce que nous pouvons bénéficier des fonds d'adaptation sur le climat ou alors comment est-ce qu'on peut construire des projets qui vont prendre en considération les réalités locales. les réalités locales, en fait, en ce qui concerne le changement climatique? Je ne sais pas.
Well, there are a few questions from Nathaniel, and I was looking at one of them with a follow-up from Edliha. I don't know if I could take that. Nathaniel wanted to know what the trade union demands towards COP are. And it's interesting that, Nathaniel, you asked that, because just this week, we just finalized a COP preparatory meeting by African trade unions and global union federations, where we try to identify what our priorities were or would be at COP27. And I must say that indeed on the list of priorities for trade unions, we want to champion the questions around finance. Finance to support climate and to support developing countries. Again, as you may know, developed countries have pledged an amount of $100 billion per year to support the building the adaptative capacities of developing countries. However, this pledge has not been fulfilled in any way for several years. And so it's become a recurring issue every year at the COP. And this is why some people are actually beginning to lose faith in the COP, because more and more it's becoming a talk shop where we just go, there are commitments, there are pledges by industrialized countries, but there's nothing more to it, you know? And so for us, we think that it's important for us to continue to push for this, though, as much as we are not seeing much results. It's important for us to continue to push this and hold countries accountable to their promises, especially because, as I made the case, the manifestations of climate impacts are all around us in Africa, and it's so dire. But there's also the issue of really not having the capacities to be able to really build resilience or to address the impacts, which is leading to all these questions around food insecurity, around loss of lives, loss of livelihoods. And so we think it's important as trade unions to continue to push this. We are joining the African Group of Negotiators, which is the governments or the parties of the COP. The African group have also met, and high on the agenda for them is a question around finance. They're actually saying we want this $100 billion to be increased to $120 billion. I don't know how realistic that is, being that commitments to $100 billion have not actually been fulfilled. But the fact is that we also know that resources exist. And if you look at the economies, I mean, we all saw during COVID how countries were able to mobilize and really put in the needed resources to really support people and to address the pandemic. So there's the question whether we still, or whether our countries are still not really seeing the urgency of the climate crisis, or whether we are not really, countries are just not ready to put in the financial resources. It's not so much that they don't exist. We're also seeing now with Ukraine, Russia, there's a lot of money that's being pumped in, you know, and so the resources exist, but then it's always a bit, it's a bit of a problem when it comes to channeling it to climate issues. And so we want to continue to push this. Now there's a huge question on loss and damages beyond finances to support countries to build their adaptation capacities. There's also the whole question around loss and damages, compensation for victims, climate victims. A lot of countries have already faced so much or lost so much when it comes to climate crisis. And so there's also the need now, of the points is being made that it's gone beyond even building resilience. People have to be compensated, especially because people, especially looking at people who have not contributed or have contributed very minimally. And so it's important for us to establish also the case that the climate crisis has, I was saying that it's important for us to also know that when it comes to questions around, there are historical issues when it comes to the climate crisis. A lot of countries have developed on fossil. These countries have huge historical accumulations of of global gas emissions. And this is why developing countries continue to say these countries have to be held accountable. These countries that have otherwise contributed so much to global carbon emissions have to support countries that are actually still at the brink of development, because the questions also of why, of how now African countries cannot probably develop in the way that developed countries have developed. And so this is why the questions around finance, the questions around loss and damages are so important. And I'll tie this into the question that Edlira raises about reparations. This is also becoming a topical issue now, where you find a lot of social movements, a lot of civil society groups trying to push this, that countries have to pay reparations to support or to really, support the climate crisis. Countries that have, developing countries have all, or developed countries have all developed somehow on the back of colonization. And there are these new and emerging issues of how countries of colonized, colonial masters have to really pay back reparations. And there's the movement that's emerging that thinks that these reparations can also go into support the whole climate agenda. Trade unions haven't really asserted ourselves so much in these discussions. However, I know there are a lot of movements on the continent that are pushing this. It's for me, it's a long rope, and I think that it's useful discussions to have, but I don't know, I don't see it happening anytime in the near future, because as we see it, even commitments, just normal financial commitments to support developing countries is a problem. And so it's a difficult rope, but this actually also gives an image of how climate negotiations take place within the international sphere. And it clearly shows the dynamics, between developing countries and developed countries, where the power lies and also interest. And this, for me, I think is something that should also be explored, when it comes to the whole climate crisis, the fact that there's not really any balance, it's not a balanced playing field, and marginalized countries, marginalized people continue to also face even more marginalization. And that's why we say the climate crisis is very much linked to class issues. It further exacerbates inequalities. And these are all things that we need to continue to explore.
Merci une fois de plus, Rhoda. J'espère que la personne qui a posé la question est un peu satisfaite de la réponse en ce moment. À présent, nous allons prendre, on peut dire, une dernière question des participants. Et nous voyons Ibrahima qui pose également la question. Ibrahima, si tu es connecté, tu peux ouvrir ton micro et puis tu poses ta question directement.
Voilà. Bonjour tout le monde. Vous m'entendez? Ça passe?
Oui, c'est bon, on te suit très bien.
Voilà, donc je me réjouis vraiment de participer à ce master. Ça a été très instructif. Je suis Ibrahima Seck, je suis du Sénégal. Je suis secrétaire général d'un syndicat appelé Syndicat des travailleurs libres dans le secteur du transport. Voilà, donc comme a dit tout à l'heure ma camarade camerounaise, je me suis intéressé à cette formation parce que au niveau de nos organisations syndicales ici au Sénégal, je ne vois pas l'importance qu'ils donnent à cette thématique. En tout cas, je ne le ressens pas trop. Et nous continuons, comme a dit tout à l'heure la conférencière, que je salue au passage, nous vivons effectivement les effets en tout cas de la crise climatique. Nous le vivons de façon plus générale de la crise environnementale dans nos pays, par l'inondation, par la sécheresse, par les déplacements de population, effectivement. Et c'est ça qui m'a amené à participer à cette formation. Mais ce que je voudrais dire, c'est que est-ce qu'au niveau du CSI, ils ont instruit, en tout cas les centrales syndicales, de mettre des points focaux pour prendre en charge cette question. Parce que c'est très important. Ça ne peut que passer par l'éducation et la formation. Moi, en tout cas, au niveau de mon syndicat, je mettrai quelqu'un qui va s'occuper de ces problématiques parce que c'est très important et je sais que c'est important. Nos vies ont départ parce qu'on subit effectivement chaque jour les effets de cette, en tout cas de ces crises-là, de cette crise. Je voudrais savoir, est-ce qu'il y a des instructions qui sont données au niveau des centrales pour que cette question soit mise en exergue au niveau, en tout cas, des plans d'action syndicaux dans les différents pays. Voilà, donc je vous remercie. La présentatrice a été très instruite. Je suis vraiment très satisfait d'avoir participé à cette démonstration. Merci.
Ok, merci beaucoup Ibrahima pour ta question. Je pense que pour que Rhoda puisse faire une synthèse ou alors un résumé à la fin, elle va prendre ta question vers la fin. Donc, cette question, elle va répondre à cette question pour conclure en fait son propos. Okay, c'est vrai, il y a également une dernière question qui concernait, que Nathaniel a posée. Rhoda, il y a cette question. Il y a la COP27. Nous avons la COP27 qui est en Égypte. Je crois que dans quelques jours, qui sera en novembre en Égypte. On aimerait savoir quelle est la question que les syndicalistes africains posent sur la table pendant la COP27, parce qu'on sait que tu travailles également sur ces questions. Donc, quelle est la question que les syndicats africains vont poser sur la table pour la COP27? Et peut-être en guise de conclusion, pour que tu prends un peu ces dernières questions pour résumer et peut-être donner ton mot de fin, existe-t-il des exemples de syndicats et d'autres mouvements sociaux, tels que les mouvements écologistes ou de femmes, qui s'unissent pour lutter contre le changement climatique? Comment la CSI a-t-elle facilité de telles alliances? Quels sont les nombreux obstacles à la création et au maintien de telles alliances sur le terrain? Merci une fois de plus. Je ne sais pas si tu peux prendre cette question et peut-être tu conclus avec ton mot de fin par rapport à cet échange de cet après-midi.
Yeah, thank you so much. I feel 1 hour was not enough for this discussion. It's been very lively, very rich, very participatory, and I really appreciate the active participation. Responding specifically to Comrade Ibrahima from Senegal, first of all, to mention that the transport sector is one sector that is heavily going to be affected when it comes to the climate, when it comes to climate responses. And so it's important that your union begins to assert itself in the climate question. But I totally also agree that a lot of unions are not doing this, specifically for various reasons, especially in Francophone country. We see that there's not really climate issues are not a priority for most organizations, specifically because they probably do not have the expertise, they don't have the human capacity, they don't have resources to really take up the issue. And this is very much linked to your question around whether we have a network of people. ITUC Africa has a network of people that work on climate issues, and it's highly encouraged that unions assign or dedicate someone to follow and work on climate issues, even if the person does not have the capacity, because the role of ITUC Africa is really to develop the capacities to support our affiliates through the process. And we are open to doing this. We are even looking forward to doing this more in the region, in Francophone Africa. So really important for us to identify someone who would follow climate issues, send us the contact of that person. We would include that person in our group of network and focal persons who are doing tremendous and incredible work in their countries, most of whom did not really start with adequate capacity, but then over the years have built the capacity and are doing well. Because I think it's also important to make the case that the real sites of the real sites to work is a national level. At regional level, we are available to provide the support, to provide in terms of capacity, in terms of resources, but then the real work is on the ground at national level, where you have to continue to engage to see the difference and to make the difference that you want to see. And so we really encourage this. And I really hope that following your course, after you've deepened your knowledge on the issues, you may possibly have the space to really have a network, or you are open to join the network of climate change focal persons at ITUC Africa. I hope that my details may be available somehow and people can reach me. I'm happy to actually see several of our affiliates here whom I didn't realize. I think the advertisements went far, so I'm happy to see people and more interest in the climate issues. And I'm hoping that at least this course would even ignite that more interest for us to all continue to push the agenda. I think I responded to the question of Natalia on COP. The priorities for the trade unions are support to finance, commitment, fulfillment of commitments, financial commitments over the years by industrialized countries, loss and damages is high on the agenda, and then also questions around just transition. But we want to infuse or integrate just transition in all these demands, because somehow they are interlinked. And so just transition is also key, but then also calling on countries to increase their mitigation ambitions. As we all know, commitments that have been made or pledges that are coming forward by countries to cut down emissions are nowhere near the global goal of reaching 1.5 degrees by 2030. So we really also are holding or calling on governments, on countries, especially industrialized countries, to really step up their commitments to cutting down emissions. Developing countries also, not only building their adaptation capacities, but also to mitigate and cut down their commitments and cut down emissions as much as they can. And so these are also some of parts of the demands that we are raising. But just to round up and to say that the climate crisis really calls on everyone, all of us, to really join hands to build a concerted voice for action. And indeed, everyone has a role to play in this, whether young, whether woman, a worker, a farmer. It's become so important for us all to really come together in different ways, at different levels, from the home, from our workplaces, from our different sectors within our countries, that we all have a role to play in really cutting down drastically emissions and building that power, that consciousness to really also even change our ways of consuming. So it's not only production patterns, but we really also have to adopt sustainable consumer patterns. And so these are all little ways that we all can contribute to the change. And it's become so imperative now on us, for us to really take up action, because indeed we have so much, to lose without action. As they say, climate inaction, or the cost of inaction, is so much more than the cost of action. And so it's imperative on us to all really continue educating people within our workplaces, within our countries, influencing policy, building campaigns, and most importantly, mobilizing and trying to build a strong climate movement, which is really the only way to address this crisis. And so I hope you all come on board with me as we build this movement, and in our own small ways, try to really address the climate crisis, because our children will hold us, the next generation will hold us accountable if we do not do this. It's imperative that we see how we can do this for the interest, if not for ourselves, but for future generations. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Rhoda, pour cette belle manière de conclure cette session d'échange, où tu nous dis le coût de l'inaction est plus que le coût de l'action. Vraiment, tu nous appelles tous à entrer en boîte, parce que nous tous, nous sommes affectés par les effets du changement climatique, et nous tous, nous devons agir pour pouvoir penser à un environnement plus durable pour nos futures générations. Une fois de plus, vraiment, la Global University te dit merci pour avoir honoré de notre invitation. Tu es de la FESTOC, donc nous sommes également ravis d'avoir participé, parce qu'on fait cette initiative en partenariat avec la CSI Afrique. Vraiment, nous sommes honorés pour cet échange qui était vraiment enrichissant, et vraiment, nous te disons une fois de plus merci beaucoup pour être avec nous cet après-midi. Et à présent, nous allons retourner vers nos participants. Comme vous savez, ça c'est un cours en ligne qui aura lieu du 15 octobre jusqu'au 15 novembre. Donc, nous vous invitons, ceux qui sont ici aujourd'hui, qui ne sont pas encore inscrits, de bien vouloir s'inscrire. Je crois que le lien est partagé dans le chat box. Veuillez vous inscrire pour suivre ce cours en ligne qui est sur la juste et vert, la question écologique du travail. Et dans le cadre de ce programme, nous aurons plusieurs autres sessions d'échange. Malheureusement, nous ne pouvons pas prendre les questions de tout le monde. Comme vous pouvez le constater, nous sommes un peu tenus par le temps. Mais inscrivez-vous. Il y a beaucoup de questions que vous posez, que vous aurez les réponses en suivant cette formation de vous-même. Comme vous le savez, c'est une formation qui prend le temps. Vous prenez votre temps que vous pouvez prendre pour la suivre à vos horaires et vraiment, vous allez beaucoup gagner. Et je vois, il y a beaucoup de personnes qui ont demandé cette vidéo. Allez suivre notre page sur Facebook, la Global University. Vous allez suivre notre page. Je crois qu'on va mettre le lien là. Vous pouvez resuivre cet échange que nous avons eu aujourd'hui. On a également un groupe en français, la Juste et Vert, question écologique du travail, que vous pouvez resuivre cet échange. Donc, ne vous inquiétez pas. Inscrivez-vous, vous aurez tous ces échanges, vous allez poser vos questions à tous les experts dont vous voulez et je pense que ça va davantage agrandir le nombre des défenseurs de changement climatique ou alors ceux qui pensent que les syndicalistes ont un rôle à jouer dans la question de changement climatique. Une fois de plus, c'était un réel plaisir pour nous de vous avoir aujourd'hui pour cet échange que nous avons eu sur la question qui a été très pertinente de cet après-midi, comme vous pouvez le savoir, sur la crise environnementale en Afrique et quelle est la réaction des syndicats ou alors pour les alliances syndicaux. Merci une fois de plus d'avoir honoré nous avoir honoré par votre présence. Nous espérons que vous avez aimé et nous espérons davantage avoir ce type de session avec vous. Inscrivez-vous simplement et vous serez la bienvenue pour ces partages. Merci à tout le monde. Nous voulons dire merci à Ibrahim, merci Marcel, merci à Nathaniel, merci à Régine qui a honoré notre présence et merci beaucoup à toute l'équipe technique de la Global First University, Global University. On a Elira, on a Matidja, on a Yen qui sont ici avec nous cet après-midi. Nous avons Catherine de la CSI, Festock. Nous voulons dire merci. Nous voulons dire merci beaucoup à nos interprètes de cet après-midi qui sont derrière les micros. On vous dit merci beaucoup. Nous avons chaîne connectée également. On vous dit merci beaucoup pour votre présence parmi nous et vraiment passez un très bon week-end. Pour les participants, demain, nous aurons un nouveau chapitre de notre cours. Vraiment, il faut vous adapter, prenez le temps, vous suivez le cours, répondez aux exercices qui ont été posés et je pense que ça serait un très bon échange. Merci une fois de plus de votre présence.